This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. On today's show, the role of corporations is looming large in the presidential campaign. Today, we learn about the history of corporations from author and media theorist Douglas Rushkoff, who says since the Middle Ages, corporations have tried to prevent the rise of a middle class. A historian who writes about FDR links him to President Obama in terms of the paranoid hatred that both engendered among Republican extremists. And Bill Press talks with Congressman Peter Welch of Vermont and the National Journal's Major Garrett about sequestration and the fiscal cliff. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Media theorist Douglas Rushkoff has written a book called Life Incorporated. In it, he explains how corporations that arose in the Middle Ages have, through today, acted against the interests of the middle class. And we're joined now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, by media theorist and counterculture figure Douglas Rushkoff. He's the originator of ideas such as viral media, social currency, and screenagers. He's been at the forefront of digital society from its beginning, correctly predicting the rise of the net, the dot-com boom and bust, as well as the current financial crisis. He is the author of the book Life, Inc., about the power of corporations. Douglas Rushkoff, thanks for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Hi, good to be with you.
You write that corporations have infiltrated our daily lives to the point where most Americans willingly adopt corporate values instead of their own. How did that happen?
Well, it took like 600 years. I mean, it's funny. I mean, in some sense, the Bible is the best example of how that happens. You know, you spend 400 years in slavery, as the Israelites did in Egypt, and eventually they start thinking like their masters. The way it happened to us really is that we were systematically disconnected from our ability to create value and to transact that value. So that, you know, when the initial charter monopolies were formed way back in the 12 and 1300s, the main legal shift really was to make it illegal for people to work for themselves and instead to force them to work for companies that had monopolies in a particular industry. So if you used to think of yourself as a shoemaker, now you're an employee of a shoe company. And so that was sort of the start. The next phase was really just using very long-distance industrial-age processes so that consumers were disconnected from the people producing for them. So instead of me buying something from Joe, the oat mill operator, now I'm buying a box of oats that are being shipped from 2,000 miles away. And that human relationship that I used to have with a producer ends up being kind of copied by a brand, you know, by a picture of a Quaker on the box. So instead of having a relationship with Joe, I have a relationship with a brand. So really, step by step, what happened is we begin outsourcing our employment. We outsource our purchasing. We outsource our investing. We outsource our savings to very, long distance, far away companies who we don't really know, and slowly really rob ourselves and our communities of the kinds of value creation and transaction that used to define life.
Is this a trend that continues and will continue in the foreseeable futures?
Well, it's interesting. I feel like this might.
I mean, obviously, we're talking about, as you said, over the course of 600 years or so. But I mean, and obviously at different times in history, it's moved a little faster than other times in history, perhaps. But is that continuing?
Well, I mean, I think it may actually not be able to continue any further. I mean, the wall that we ran up against is the system, this economic system that kind of perpetuated corporatism depends on expansion. It really needs to expand at the rate of interest because the operating system, if you will, on which corporatism runs is central bank issued currency. Before corporatism, there were local currencies. It wasn't really just barter. There were all kinds of different currencies based on grain and other commodities. There was really an ecosystem of monies that people used. And now we only have one kind of money, and it's a money that's lent out at interest and that requires the expansion of an economy. And what we really came to, first at the end of World War II, and then finally now at the sort of the end of the dominance of the IMF and the World Bank, is we no longer have room to expand. We can't go into some other territory. There's no other region that will permit our entry. So the system kind of folds back in on itself. And now value creation really is something that's beginning to happen on the periphery in a peer-to-peer fashion. We have the net, which is allowing for really a decentralized forms of business that aren't really depending on these, giant centralized banks and institutions. People can start entire companies in their dorm room at Harvard without investment capital. Mm-hmm. So the sort of the way in which corporatism has functioned is being undermined both by geopolitical forces and by a very new sort of range of technologies that allow for things to happen and to blow up from disproportionately to what we're used to. So I think we are looking at the end of a way of doing business and the beginning of another.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Douglas Rushkoff, author of the book Life, Inc., about the power of corporations. Now that corporations have been declared people by the Supreme Court, do they have even more power than ever?
In a certain way they do. They have more power over writing laws than they ever did before. While laws may have initially been written on behalf of corporations, now corporations have not just lobbyists, but people in them who write the law that ends up going on the books. My friends in my sort of technology theorist friends, that people with their freshly minted PhDs from Berkeley and elsewhere in new media end up going to work for places like Google and Microsoft, where they craft the legislation that will be used to regulate the telecommunications industry. And all industries are like that, the oil industry and pharmaceutical industry. And that ability seems to have increased over time. So now, while corporations achieve, some measure of personhood under Lincoln, their citizenship under the current court is a little frightening. I think it's even frightening to folks like Mitt Romney, who one would think benefit from this, because it really removes some of the last safeguards for human intervention in the way laws are written. That's sort of what representative democracy was for. And now if you close that feedback loop between corporations and the law, it becomes very hard for humans to protect their interest against these, highly abstracted economic players.
Why shouldn't corporations, especially publicly owned ones, go about their business in a free market of supplying goods and services to willing buyers?
I think they should. I think that would be really cool. But that's not what they have. We don't have a free market. We have a highly regulated corporatist landscape, where true competition has actually been weeded out. That was the purpose of the chartered monopoly to begin with, was to prevent competition. In return for locking in one company's position in an industry, they would give the monarch a piece of the money. That's what the corporation was for, is to prevent the turnover, to prevent the rise of the sort of merchant middle class, and to lock in the existing players. So, I think the kind of free market that, say, Adam Smith was talking about, where small businesses and local businesses could compete on a level playing field against giant, long-distance foreign corporations, would be a much healthier state.
You've commented that this is an artificial economy we're living in and that the financial crisis of the past few years is an opportunity to reinvent the economy. What do you mean, and how do we do it?
Well, I mean, most simply, as I'm sure most of your listeners know, the derivatives market makes up a larger percentage of financial transaction than the supply and selling of goods and services. In order to meet the rate of interest, in order to meet their debt structures, companies began using derivative financial instruments that could, in theory, earn more money in less time. That was kind of the object, was to find ways to earn money currently rather than earning money through these sort of long-term investments, so that whoever was close to the value creation was sort of the sucker, and whoever moved up and became closer and closer to a bank or a meta bank or a meta bank, some kind of a holding company, whoever moved up that sort of ladder of abstraction, as Jack Welch taught us, those were perceived of as the winners. And what it led to was an economy where creating value is no longer a way to profit. The way that we unwind this, I mean, unfortunately, it takes a little bit of pain. The way we unwind this is cities and regions learn that banks are no longer willing to lend money to a corporation to set up shop, to open a factory, to get them jobs. Right? People will be jobless long enough to discover that they don't actually need jobs in order to work. They don't need a bank to lend money to a corporation to give employment to people, which is ultimately ends up being an extractive force on the value creation of a community. People will realize if they have skills and they have needs, they have the basis for an actual economy, and that probably 60, 70, or even 80% of their needs can be met locally. They can work for one another using various forms of exchanges, like what people are doing in Greece, where the euro has gotten too expensive for people, so they've created their own exchange markets to supply each other with goods and services, real stuff, real agriculture, real medicine. And, sure, you will still, as a town, want to produce something that you can export so that you can get your iPhones, so that you can get your oil, so that you can get the things that you can't provide locally or provide to one another. But the ratio of that which communities provide for themselves against that which they get from somewhere else will change dramatically.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Douglas Rushkoff, again, author of the book Life, Inc. And among one of the provocative assertions in your book, Life, Inc., is that the development of corporations and centralized currency 600 years ago caused the plague. Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. The plague always gets blamed by Renaissance historians. It gets blamed on medievalism. They call it the Dark Ages until the Renaissance came, and then we got the great patrons of the arts and these wonderful courts and centralized institutions. Where if you actually look at the last few centuries of what we call the medieval era, you have what's known as the Age of Cathedrals. This is when the cathedrals of Europe were built. This is when towns got so wealthy that their main means for investing in the future was building cathedrals as tourist attractions for future generations. And that's because these towns were using local currency. These were currencies that were based on what you brought to the grain store, and they would generally lose value over time. So they were very biased towards spending rather than towards hoarding or saving. And because everybody was spending, the money circulated a lot, and everyone ended up employed, and everyone ended up producing. There was all this preventative maintenance being done on machines. People got very healthy. They were working only 3 and 4 days a week and eating 4 meals. And women were taller than at any time until the 1970s in England. I mean, it was actually a hugely prosperous moment, but it threatened the aristocracy. This was the rise of the middle class, of the merchant class in Europe. So the invention of central currency and its implementation by kings like Philip the Fair in France was really designed to stop the rise of the middle class and to figure out a way for the upper class to simply make money by having money, right? They hired financiers really from the Middle East to come up, or what was, I guess, then the Ottoman Empire, to come up and teach them how to develop financial instruments that would prevent this fluidity and slow down this motion, this rise, this seemingly inevitable rise of peasants into a middle class. So central currency had to be loaned out at interest, and corporations had to be worked for rather than worked with. So all of these regions that were creating value, they lost their access to the commons. They weren't allowed to grow crops anymore and bring them to market and sell them to one another. Everyone had to work for central corporation, for workshops. They left where they lived. They went, it looked a little bit like China now. They went into the city to work in factories and have jobs and went back out. They lost their ability to do subsistence farming, and they started to live in squalor, and in cities with rats and everything else. And it was I forget now, I think it was 27 years or 37 years after the implementation of central currency in France is when you get the plague, is when you have the major outbreak of the plague. So if we don't revise history, but actually look at history the way it happened in the years it happened, you see, it was after the implementation of these highly centralizing, value extracting Renaissance era economic reforms that you start to see this 2 or 3 century long rise in people's fortunes really be very rapidly reversed, and leading to a much more exploitative and centralized culture.
Very interesting stuff. Douglas Rushkoff, the originator of ideas such as viral media, social currency. He's been at the forefront of digital society from its beginning. He's the author of the book Life, Inc. about the power of corporations. Douglas, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thanks for having me.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going, and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up in just a few minutes, a historian who studied the 1932 presidential campaign says it was the beginning of a paranoid style in American politics, and it survives today. But right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Even a hog must sometimes gag at the stench of its own sty. Maybe that's why some corporate lobbyists have launched a campaign to spiff up K Street, Washington's corridor of shameless high-dollar influence peddlers. The pay-to-play profession is so soiled and stinky that even the odious Newt Gingrich couldn't stand it, claiming in his hapless presidential run this year that he's a corporate, quote, consultant, not a lobbyist. Adding to the industry's reputation for ick is the sight of Jack Abramoff, the convicted sleazeball lobbying hustler who's now on a remorse tour, charging groups across the country $10,000 a pop to hear him talk about, get this, ethics reform. Sad to say, but lobbying is a huge and hugely profitable industry. There are 535 members of Congress, 1 president, and 23 cabinet officers in charge of our national government, but they are constantly swarmed by 12,000 registered Washington lobbyists. These hired guns hauled in $3.3 billion last year for helping big oil, big banks, and other biggies gouge us. Unsurprisingly, the American people are disgusted by them. So the head of the American League of Lobbyists, yes, lobbyists have their own lobbying group, now says that a spritz of magnolia-scented Glade or maybe one of those pine tree-shaped air fresheners is needed to improve K Street's smell. Would he include actually staunching the stench by banning lobbyists from doling out campaign cash to lawmakers they're hustling? Oh, gosh, no. That might actually work. Instead, the lobbyist is proposing less pungent reforms like giving, quote, ethics training to those in the trade. Wow, imagine how that would have changed Jack Abramoff. This is Jim Hightower saying, to make real change, go to the People's Watchdog group Public Citizen at citizen.org.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Historian Sally Denton traces the paranoid style in American politics from FDR straight through to President Obama. While things were worse in the 30s, she says, Obama was slow to recognize the depth of hatred emanating from his political opponents. And joining us today on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Sally Denton, who is an acclaimed investigative reporter, author, historian with an extensive background in print and broadcast journalism, as well as magazine and book writing. Her latest book is The Plots Against the President, FDR, A Nation in Crisis, and the Rise of the American Right. Sally Denton, nice to talk to you again on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you.
So, you chronicle the rise of the American right as a response to the election of FDR during the Depression. Are those Roosevelt haters the grandfathers or great-grandfathers of today's Tea Partiers?
I think they are. I began this, I decided to write this book while doing research at the Hoover Institution a couple of years ago on my most recent previous book, The Pink Lady, about Helen Gahagan Douglas. And I was looking at the right-wing, there are a lot of files at the Hoover Institution about the early right-wing in America. And while researching the 1950 election between Helen Gahagan Douglas and Richard Nixon, the smear campaign, I came across these files about the Liberty League and the American Legion. And basically, the Liberty League was really the fount of what I think goes on to be the organized right-wing elements in American society. Now, not necessarily right-wing Republican. There were just as many disaffected conservative Democrats in the Liberty League, but it was a small group of America's wealthiest men who were taking it upon themselves to see that that American politics went in the direction that was more favorable to them, and really kind of inspired by a fear that Roosevelt was trying to redistribute the nation's wealth.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, you wrote specifically about FDR in that time period, but we are making comparisons between FDR and today's situation with the Obama administration. And along those lines, the Obama administration has had to deal with economic issues almost as bad as those facing FDR, although obviously FDR's were certainly worse. Is it fair to compare the two administrations, or is Obama having an easier time of it, if you will, politically?
No, I think it's fair to compare them. I mean, they're very much, they're different. We're talking about an 80-year time spread, but the economic conditions, relatively speaking, were probably every bit as bad, or close to every bit as bad now as back then. The difference is that there are a lot more safety nets in place in 2008 to 2012. There were no safety nets in 1933. But there were also it's also a much more complex situation that Obama faced, where so much of industry was tied to Wall Street and to the failing companies, and the population is much larger. So I think it is fair to make some of the comparisons, even though it's a very, a wildly different time period. But I think that the paranoid style of American politics, which is what my epilogue is about, that still remains, and that this has really been going on since the 1930s. Where, I mean, you had smear campaigns in the 1800s and everything, but the 1930s really saw the rise of these kind of fringe elements. That I have a chapter called a rainbow of colored shirts, where you had these organizations, the silver shirts, the white shirts, the black shirts, the brown shirts, and they were all these kind of paramilitary, extreme, similar to the Tea Party, except that many of these actually had a paramilitary arm to them. But the Aryans and the Christian Coalition and the anti-Muslim, the anti-Semitic, all of these kind of anti-everything, anti the other, I think really found their roots in the early 1930s. The fear of the other.
Right. And one of the episodes that you spend a lot of time on in your book is the assassination attempt against President-elect Roosevelt, which in fact killed Chicago's mayor. Mm-hmm. Some people think the gunman was actually trying to kill the mayor. What really happened?
Well, the gunman, Giuseppe Zangari, he was an Italian immigrant and anarchist and anti-fascist, and he saw Roosevelt. It was the interregnum. He had not yet taken office. He saw Roosevelt as completely the same as Herbert Hoover, that all American presidents were imperialist and pro-fascist, and at the time, America did have a very pleasant relationship with Mussolini. Zangara absolutely was going after Roosevelt, and he admitted to that, confessed to it, and was killed in the swiftest execution in American history, I think. Just within weeks of the assassination attempt. But there was an attempt to downplay the assassination attempt on Roosevelt and make it look like the intended target was Cermak, the mayor of Chicago. And Roosevelt participated in that attempt to downplay and deflect the attention, I think because he knew that the country really was on such a precipice that it was so perilous and shaky that an assassination attempt might have thrown it over the edge. I think that there was this widespread sense that America should not be that there should not be any more fomenting of fear than there already was abroad in the land. But so there was a lot of speculation that maybe the gunman was aiming for Cermak, who was there accompanying Roosevelt, because Cermak was taking on Al Capone in Chicago, and so rumors spread that it was a mob hit. And but Roosevelt knew that he was the intended target. His advisor Raymond Moley interviewed the gunman within hours of the shooting, and the gunman always, never even deflected for a moment from saying that he wanted to kill all capitalists and, especially Roosevelt.
We're speaking with Sally Denton and talking about her latest book, The Plots Against the President, FDR, A Nation in Crisis and the Rise of the American Right, and from time to time making some comparisons to President Obama's situation today. But before we make another comparison, more about the book itself. You also delve deeply into a plot by Wall Street plutocrats to actually overthrow the president and install a former general as president. Not a lot of people know about that, so tell us how that plot came about and how it was foiled.
Well, that was another one of these crazy deals. It was a response to Roosevelt's monetary policies that a group of Wall Street businessmen, a bond salesman and a member of a private banking firm, a group of men basically approached General Smedley Darlington Butler, who was a retired Marine general, and he was kind of the iconic general, the iconic soldier. There were 500,000 veterans who had marched with the bonus army a year before, and Butler was seen. He was outspoken against the Marines and the U.S. military, just kind of furthering American capitalist interests throughout the world rather than defending America. So he had the undying support of this 500,000 veterans, and so the group of Wall Street plotters went to Butler and wanted him to lead this 500,000 man army for a peaceful coup to march on Washington, replace Roosevelt, and install Butler as the the dictator. Basically, it was a general authority. As they thought that they had figured it out constitutionally. They thought that Roosevelt was in over his head and he would step aside, and that the Vice President John Nance Garner didn't want the presidency, and that then Cordell Hull, who was Secretary of State, I think, who would be in the line of succession, that he was too old and he would step aside, and so they would install this general. But it backfired when the general basically blew the whistle on it. He thought it was treason, and he went to Congress. He went to J. Edgar Hoover, who went directly to President Roosevelt, and so the whole thing was thwarted. But it was a scary and it was zany and crazy, but there's no doubt that it was a seriously undertaken plot.
Now we're going to switch gears and talk more about back to President Obama. Is it too early to say how Obama will be regarded by historians, do you think? I mean, besides getting reelected, what does he have to do to go down in history as one of the great presidents?
Well, I think that in the second term, and as I mean, I'm not a political scholar by any means, but I think that in the second term, if he can do some of the things that he feels that for some reason he felt he was unable to do in the first term, I think he will definitely go down as a great president. I think he will anyway, but I think that the main difference between Roosevelt and Obama was in the first 100 days when Obama really had both houses of Congress, he might have been able to accomplish more. I think he underestimated the depth of hatred for him. And Roosevelt, he came in on, he was inaugurated the first week of March on Saturday, and by Monday morning, by Sunday morning, he was submitting, he was calling Congress into a special session, and by Monday morning was submitting legislation, and fully expected to basically do the banking act, close the bank, put a bank holiday and send Congress home. But Congress reacted so swiftly in support because they felt that the nation was in crisis, that he just kept them in for 100 days and just rammed through everything that he could. And I think that Obama, I think it's dangerous to draw too close of parallels, but I thought that President Obama might have been more effective if he had done the same thing when he had the goodwill of the newly elected, of both houses of Congress and his newly elected status. I think that he might have been able to shove a lot of things through quickly, and that opportunity was lost, and the forces against him then were so galvanized that it became impossible.
Well, maybe he can take control of Congress in this next election, and he'll have a second shot at it.
He'll have a second shot, and hopefully he'll take it this time.
That's right. Sally Denton, acclaimed investigative reporter, author, and historian with an extensive background in print and broadcast journalism, as well as magazine and book writing. Her latest book, The Plots Against the President, FDR, A Nation in Crisis, and the Rise of the American Right. Sally, thanks so much for your time today. We look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect Stand Up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. And now Bill Press has a conversation with Congressman Peter Welch of Vermont and the National Journal's Major Garrett about sequestration and the fiscal cliff.
We are here on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., booming out to you live all the way across this great land of ours on Current TV and on your local progressive talk radio station. And we like being close to the Capitol so we can keep track of all the important decisions that are being made, all the important legislation that's being passed, all the great progress made by this Congress. What
town are you in?
Yeah, exactly. Not much happening down there right now. Why not? Here's a man who maybe can tell us why not. Congressman Peter Welch from the at-large Congressman for the state of Vermont. Congressman, good to see you today.
Good to be here.
Joining us, so we're doubling up on him today. I needed some help to grill Peter Welch, so Major Garrett here, covering the Congress and the White House for National Journal Major. Good to have you on board again. So, Congressman, Dick Cheney was up on Capitol Hill the other day saying, no, we cannot let this sequester happen because the defense cuts to the Pentagon will be too great. So this is, Congress had a way out of this, right?
We did. It's a kind of only in Washington story. A year ago, Congress had the super committee charged with coming up with $1.2 trillion in debt reduction. It could be any combination of cuts or revenues. They failed. But Congress thought it was pretty smart. And these were the Republicans, Mr. Boehner, Mr. Ryan, Senator McConnell. They put the threat of automatic cuts going into effect if the super committee failed.
Didn't do its job. Yeah.
Super committee failed. The automatic cuts are going to go into effect, half from Pentagon, half from domestic discretionary spending. So, fast forward.
How big? What are we talking about?
$1.2 trillion.
Over 10 years.
Over 10 years.
Yeah.
Half and half. And now, as the day comes, January 1, when those will go into effect, the Republicans are saying, who did that?
Yeah.
In fact, yesterday we passed a Sequester Transparency Act where we ordered the OMB to tell Congress what it did with the sequester. We wanted to know what would happen. What did we do? Why did we do it? What will happen if what we ordered to be done is done? And it is pretty bizarre in a way because Congress passed a law and then asked, wait a minute, what will happen if
it's
in
like
fact
a pre-autopsy?
Yeah, so
you want to know ahead of time what the autopsy is going to show?
It's a serious story about congressional dysfunction because, in fact, if we want to deal with the debt, it's a solvable problem. But you've got to put everything on the table. The Pentagon has got to make a contribution. We've got to make some reforms in the spending on health care in particular, but we have to have revenues. Now, everybody knows that. That's ultimately what's going to have to be done in order to get from where we are to where we need to be. And also, everybody knows that if we had these across-the-board cuts that make no sense, it's just a Hail Mary pass, it'll be damaging to the economy. It will be doubling down on austerity. But the Republicans wanted this. Now they're trying to wiggle out of it. But they also rejected it when they passed the Ryan budget, which not only blew through the Pentagon sequester, it raised Pentagon spending and lowered taxes.
But, Major, I was at the briefing yesterday, and Jay Carney made the point the president doesn't want this sequester.
OMB does not want this either. OMB has said
yeah.
the threat of these across-the-board spending cuts was meant to provoke action. It was not meant to actually happen.
Right.
And the construct, crude though it was at the time of the Budget Control Act, which is the law under which this operates, was if we don't have this sort of Damocles, if you will, over the political operatives, they're not going to act in a political or policy way. They're not going to have any motivation because it'll be all the same old politics and division. So we need a forcing mechanism, if you will. And the fear of these across-the-board spending cuts was supposed to be the forcing mechanism.
Yeah.
In addition to which, the super committee was invested with what I thought at the time and wrote at the time were elaborate and possibly unconstitutional procedural advantages to move legislation straight to the floor, bypassing every committee, no amendment, up or down vote in both chambers. And the thought was if you have this forcing mechanism and this completely grease-skid procedural thing, that will get us over the hump. Well, it didn't. It didn't even come close to getting us over the hump. But that was the theory. Well, that theory now has come completely a cropper, and we're back to what, as I wrote back in the time, is the central issue. What are the politics? Where are the votes? And what are you going to do?
Well, is there time?
That's right.
Is there time, and is there the opportunity? Could Congress undo the sequester?
Well, it could. But politically, there is such dysfunction and such division that I doubt that it will happen. And in fact, I think from a political and policy standpoint...
so they can see the iceberg coming, right? And they won't steer the ship around it.
It seems to me... Go ahead.
Well, the iceberg is coming. It's January 1, and then there's this confluence of events where the sequester goes into effect then, but also the Bush tax cuts expire then. So there's an enormous amount of pressure and leverage, actually, that shifts towards the position of the Democrats because the Republicans want all of the tax cuts. The Democrats want tax cuts up to $250. And in fact, if you repeal the tax cuts for the folks above 250, you're going to save about $1 trillion when you add an interest rate. So that's going to help us get to where we need to be quite significantly.
The only way it seems to me that Congress and the president avoid the across-the-board spending cuts is to decouple deficit reduction from debt ceiling increases in the future. Because the reason we have this in the first place is because Republicans would not increase the debt ceiling unless dollar for dollar every increase was matched by a spending cut. Well, if you're going to get rid of the across-the-board spending cuts, then you have to decouple that from debt ceiling issues.
Which
is also going to come up in sometime late this fall or the very early part of next year. So you have this huge confluence of events. Debt ceiling, Medicare, SGR, the sustainable growth rate, how you pay and reimburse Medicare doctors, the president's tax cuts, the alternative minimum tax. I mean, there is a wheelbarrow full of things with tremendous economic implications that are supposedly going to be resolved by this November election. I have my doubts.
All right. The latest thing, the plan that I've read about is letting all the tax cuts expire at the end of the year, and then the next day voting for a tax cut for the middle class.
Right.
So
that's Senator Murray. It's a good tactic. I mean, bottom line.
How would that work? So that means that the Republicans would not be voting in any way for a tax increase, but they could vote for a tax cut for the middle class.
That's correct.
Right? Is that? That's
right, because the Bush tax cuts expire for everybody as of January 1. So if the Democrats put on a tax cut bill to restore the lower rates for folks up to $250,000, anybody voting yes on that is voting for a tax cut as in relationship to the policy that's in effect at that moment. And, it would be better if we were a sensible operation, we would be sitting down and working this out. But there really is a radical difference here. The Republican approach on this is austerity will lead to prosperity. There's no evidence whatsoever for that. And that tax cuts for people that don't need them will benefit people who don't get them. I mean, that's essentially what they're arguing. And it's not an economic prescription for expanding the middle class, and it is an economic prescription for adding to the debt. But it's a very sharp ideological divide, and it's not going to get resolved before the election. The election's going to have an impact. We don't know what that'll be, because obviously it depends on what the outcome is, not just in the presidential race, but at the congressional race.
That's interesting you say that, Major. Do you agree that this is not going to be resolved before the election?
Yes. I disagree with that as a matter of policy and as an American citizen.
Yeah.
I mean, Congress can't. When I wrote about this in my column 9 weeks ago,
what the hell are they there for?
I said, I asked the rhetorical question: why are we waiting? I mean, Ben Bernanke said what was clear 3 months ago: the uncertainty of all of these things is having a materially negative effect on the economy today. Okay, people will not get jobs. Businesses will not expand because people don't know into what tax future they are investing or planning to hire or not hire 1, 2, 10, 50, 100 people. And so
you're right about that.
We are intentionally, as a country, as a political class, inflicting economic distress on our country. We are doing it ourselves. It's not China. It's not the Euro crisis. It's not Barclays. It's not LIBOR. It is us. We are failing to act, and I think President Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, and John Boehner all are complicit in this. The president could say, look, I'm calling you guys down, and I'm locking you in a room for the next 3 weeks. The hell with it. And I'm not going to do any campaign events.
But they tried that approach with the debt ceiling.
Yeah, see, I don't know that I agree with you on that, Major. I do agree with you that it's very, very serious that we're not making decisions, and the threat to our future is much more political. The challenges we face are solvable. We could deal with the deficit, but you do have to be willing to put revenues on the table. Some Republicans are privately willing to acknowledge
and some
the
did
obvious.
In the super committee. Pat Toomey put revenue on the table instead of Rob Portman in the super committee.
That's
Real
right.
revenue.
And Coburn, I believe, right?
Yes, Coburn is willing to go.
So they're there, but in the leadership, it has not changed. With Senator McConnell, he's really the epitome where he wants to fight for failure. I mean, when he said that he wanted his job definition was to make President Obama a one-term president, he meant it. And there's a willingness on his part and some of the other leadership really to fight for failure. The more we fail, the better the prospects in their view for them to win the presidency. And that's just not a good way to do your job. You know, you get elected, that's after a competitive battle. That's all fair and square. But once you get elected, it's about cooperation. I mean, the goal has to be making progress.
It used to be.
Right.
I think we all can remember the days and, the Tip O'Neill, Ronald Reagan stories or whatever, or Teddy Kennedy and Orrin Hatch stories. We can all remember the day when that was. I'm not sure there was the case, cooperation in between elections. Maybe all of that changed with Newt Gingrich.
Now, Republicans would argue that in 2010 there was a strident pro-Republican voice expressed in gaining 63 seats in the House and several seats in the Senate that suggested there was a dissatisfaction or at least a desire to slow the Obama agenda, and they are representing that point of view to slow it, if not stop it. I mean, that's what they would argue if they were here. There was an election in 2010, and it was a shattering victory for Republicans at the federal and the state level, and they are merely reflecting the will of those voters who were the last ones to cast ballots.
Congressman Peter Welch from Vermont, Major Garrett from National Journal, and all of you and me, you want to give us a call at 866-55-PRESS. We're trying to solve all of Congress's problems right now.
This is the Bill Press Show.
Here we go, 12 minutes now before the top of the next hour. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton from the District of Columbia will be in studio with us in the next hour. All right, now Congressman Peter Welch, Democrat at large from Vermont, in studio with us, as well as Major Garrett covering the Hill as well as the White House for National Journal. Gentlemen, we were talking during the break there about, and I was sort of tweaking you when I introduced you about so little being done in the Congress. Do members of Congress realize what impact that's having around the country? I mean, people just see, you're wasting your time. Not getting anything done. I mean, not you personally, you collectively.
No, we're not. I mean,
you're spending our dollars and not doing the job.
We're not, and I think it reflects two things. One, a broken Congress, and two, a very divided country. What's happening in a lot of the elections is that there is boutique districts where this is really much more of a problem at this moment, I think, on the Republican side, where any Republican who wants to bring his head out of her head out of the foxhole faces the likely Tea Party challenge in a primary, and that's very scary for them. I had an energy efficiency bill that a lot of Republicans were interested in co-sponsoring, and I asked them, I really wanted their help. And when they went back and got their advice from their political folks back home, the idea of putting their name on a bill with a Democrat could jeopardize their situation. That's where we're at. Now, it used to be that was a badge of honor. And in Vermont, if I tell folks that I've got Republican co-sponsor, they like it. They think that's an indication, hey, this might work. And we're not there now. And so some of this is because of what's going on in our district. Some of it is the dysfunction in Congress, the top-down situation that we have, the amount of money that can come in at the end of a race and literally blow somebody away. That's a problem. So there's congressional dysfunction in electoral division.
Remember, Major, when I was just thinking George W. Bush, when they were first talking about his becoming a candidate for president, one of the things that they bragged about was that he was able to work with Democrats, right?
The Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Bob Bullock, at the time, yes.
He got things done with the Democratic Congress. And they talked about
and in the
Mitt
first,
Romney also working with the Democratic legislature in Massachusetts.
Which was 85% Democrat, not 15% Republican. It can be done. It can be theorized as a political strength.
But can it still? Is it still?
No, I think the congressman is right. The sense of primaries and the paralysis that the fear of being primaried does have a demonstrable and visible effect on Republicans. Some Democrats, but far more Republicans, and that is a dimension of this problem. And I would only say my one large hope on this entire thing of congressional districts and how the lines are drawn can be found in our home state of California. Mm-hmm. And the bipartisan commission there that has taken it out of the hands of Democrats who were highly skilled at it in the 70s and 80s. The Burtons were absolute masters at drawing lines to protect every incumbent in California. That's no longer true.
Michael Berman drew the lines for Phil Burton.
And there's going to be 10 or 11 new members of Congress from California this year as a result of new lines drawn by a bipartisan process that is visible, transparent, and I hope becomes a model across the country. Because as long as this process is rigidly ideological with only a few marginal seats changing every decade, this problem is going to be very hard to solve.
You're right. They do it in Iowa, too. They have a commission. And I agree with that. I'm from Vermont, so there's only one member of Congress. And that means you really do have to listen to everybody. It's not like you're looking over your shoulder just at a primary. You're looking over your shoulder at any kind of general election challenge. So I think that getting away from these boutique districts, I think, would be good for the process.
But also it seems to me that this, a quick comment from each of you, that this election year is going to be critical because the Tea Party wave came in 2010. Now they've been here, and their attitude has been no, 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 no. Right? Is that good enough to get them reelected, or did people really maybe want them to get something done? A quick comment from each, and then we'll wrap.
It's not. I mean, there's a new type of conservative. In Vermont, where we've had people like Bob Stafford, Jim Jeffords. Conservatives were small government, low taxes, personal responsibility. But part of that personal responsibility was that you had to invest yourself in building an institution in your community. It might be your local bank, it might be the church, it might be a local business. But there was a sense of humility among conservatives that if you wanted to have the values that you thought so important to be carried on, there had to be an institution to do it.
Not today.
And I would say very, very quickly, three wave elections, 2006, 2008 favored Democrats, 2010 favored Republicans. I think there's wave fatigue in the American political populace. They now really understand that there are significant problems that we are not solving and we're not even beginning to address. And I think the wave mentality, though satisfying at a partisan level, has become dissatisfying across the board. And we may see Republicans and Democrats lose in unexpected ways this year, and that might change behavior in the next Congress.
I think it's going to take that. I really think it's going to take that. Hey, great conversation, friends. Thank you so much for coming in. Congressman, always good to see you.
Thank you.
Major, welcome back anytime.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. It's always lots of fun.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Douglas Rushkoff, Sally Denton, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to